Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
And I'm walking into the first large hangar, and I'm taken back because here are no fewer than 9 MiG-21s parked nose to nose. They're right there. I'm going, you got to be kidding me.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to Cold War history. Please make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. Lieutenant Colonel Rob Z-Man Zettel is the author of American MiG Pilot, inside the top secret US Air Force Red Eagles. He tells the Red Eagles story for the first time through the experiences of a pilot who flew Soviet MiGs to their maximum performance in simulated combat engagements, often several times a day, against some of the very best fighter pilots. Rob's vivid accounts put the listener right in the cockpit at one of the most access-restricted airfields in the entire US Air Force. We join him in part 2 of our story, describing his first interview for the Red Eagles. I'm delighted to welcome Lieutenant Colonel Rob Zettel to our Cold War conversation.
I show up promptly at a little bit before 4. Enter the Squadron building, which isn't really a squadron. It's a double-wide trailer. It's pretty nondescript. It's kind of embarrassing looking. It looks like something that at a junkyard or something. It doesn't look very like a top-secret squadron would be. But I walk in there, and I quickly notice I'm the only one in there wearing dress blues. And I'm sure they're thinking, who is this guy? And what's he doing here? Luckily, Jim Day was there at the door. He ushers me in, and me make some introductions to a few of the people that are standing around. And a few minutes later, he tells me, hey, come on down. I'm going to introduce you to George Jenin, our commander. So I go down there, and I won't belabor that too much, but I go in for an interview. It didn't last more than about 20, 30 minutes. And I go in his office, and Jim closes the door as he leaves. And in the office with him is the operations officer, a guy by the name of Major Bert Buffalo Myers. And the call sign is perfect. Buffalo, because this guy is huge. He looks like, for those of you who are familiar with the football league, looks like he could be a guard or tackle on your offensive line. He's huge. He's a big guy. But he's just standing and leaning against the wall. I don't know either one of these guys, and Jenin's gracious enough. He stands up and he shakes my hand, introduces me to Major Myers, and he tells me, have a seat. And anyway, interview goes on for about 20, 25 minutes. And at the end of it, he says, okay, thanks a lot. He gets up, and that's my cue. Okay, this interview's over. And I shake his hand. Same thing with Myers, and I walk toward the door, and I'm leaving. And as I'm leaving, he says one more thing. He says, oh, one more thing, Z-Man. He said, don't call us. We'll call you. So I walk out of there thinking, I'm probably not going to get the job, but at least they know who I am. So if I come back here a year from now, they'll know who I am, and maybe I'll have a shot at it some months later. So that's what happened. I go back to Clark shortly after New Year's in 1983, and I'm back at Clark flying my usual aggressor sorties for the next 6-7 months. And in about June of 83, I'm coming in from a mission. I just gone out and flown a 1V2 against another pair of Phantoms from the 3rd TAC Fighter Wing. And as I enter the squadron, the guy who's sitting the duty, a guy by the name of Captain Phil Gilbert, calls me over, and I'm coming in. I'm a sweaty mess. It's hot, humid. It's June in the Philippines. And I just flown a 1.1 sortie, so I got my helmet bag in one hand, my parachute slung over my other shoulder. And he says, hey, Z-Man, come here. He said, when you get done with your debrief, the colonel at the Wing DO, Deputy Commander for Operations, had just called a little bit ago. And he says, when you get done with your debrief, he wants to see you in his office. To clue everyone in, when you're told that as a fighter pilot, it's like seeing the flashing lights of the police behind you when you're driving down the road. You immediately think you're guilty of something, even though you may not be, but you certainly think you probably are. So I'm thinking, oh, God, now what did I do? I don't think I screwed anything up, but I'll find out soon enough. So I do my debrief with the F-4 Phantoms. Lasted about an hour. And then I make my way down to the Wing DO's office, which is only a few blocks away. make myself look about as presentable as I possibly can. I'm still a sweaty mess. And I tell the secretary that, hey, Captain Zettel's here to see Colonel Holden. So she says, okay, have a seat. And 10 minutes goes by and she answers the phone and she says, yeah, Captain Zettel's here to see you. And I hear some voice on the other end say, well, okay, send him in. So I walk on in, and I won't ruin the whole story for everyone, but I get in. It's not a butt chewing like I expected. It's basically him holding a piece of paper, which is a letter from Colonel George Jennin to the wing commander saying I had just been selected to be the next Red Eagle. And so that's how it happened. So it's something you can't map out and plan for. You have to have, obviously, you have to have the skill, the right credentials, the aptitude, and it's a good part of it. And that I know when I was doing research from the book, in fact, this is only about 6 months ago, only about 3 months before I finished the book, I actually went through some old files, and I had a file there that I hadn't opened probably, no kidding, 40 years. But I looked at it and I go, what is this? And in that file was a package that the wing commander at Clark had sent with letters of endorsement from my squadron commander, the wing commander, to the 57th Fighter Weapons Wing commander at Nellis saying, hey, we got a young aggressor here who would be an excellent Red Eagle. I had copies of all my OERs, letters of endorsement, my performance reports, my official photo from when I was a young captain. I'm thinking, man, this all went on behind the scenes. I had no clue this went on. So anyway, that's how it happened. And if I tried to do it all over again, probably wouldn't happen, Ian.
I doubt that, Rob. And there is loads more detail in the book. We're just skipping through various parts of the book here. Rob, if we can just move ahead. You make it to the Red Eagles. You have to undergo some training. But if you can take me through the first time you fly the MiG-21, because there's no two-seater versions of either the MiG-21 or the MiG-23 in the Red Eagle. So the first time you fly this, you are on your own.
That's correct. And it's quite amazing. I look back on it, and even all these years later, I'm still amazed that the operation actually ran as, well, not that it ran as smoothly, but that we were able to do what we did back then. I'm sure today that would never be allowed. But I show up, and within a week of being at Nellis, I go up and I get my first trip up Tonopah Test Range, TTR. And I fly up on a MU-2 turboprop airplane. We had two of them in the squadron that we flew ourselves. Our guys flew them. And I'm flying up with Lieutenant Colonel Jennin. So he knows this is my first day up there, and he makes sure that I'm on the plane with him. And all the way up there, which is about roughly an hour flight, he just tells me, okay, what to expect, what's going to go on, and he's going to give me the grand tour. So we get on the ground, and this is a top secret base. No one gets on that base without credentials and background checks and that sort of thing. So I get there, and he gives me the tour, and it's one jaw-dropping experience and surprise after another for about an hour. First off, immediately we go in the squadron building. There's no MiGs on the ramp at all. Everything's behind closed doors. Huge, immense hangars on the ramp that I'm going to be shown here shortly. But one of the first things we do is we go into a big basic briefing room. It's almost like a boardroom. And we go through the daily schedule. And of course, I'm new to all this, so I'm a sponge. I'm taking everything all in, but I'm watching. They're going through the daily schedule. And again, I've only been there about a week, so all my squadron mates are pretty new to me. I'm still learning names and faces, but they go through the flying schedule, what's going to go on, the squadrons are flying against, the types of sorties that'll be going on, any satellite overheads, yada, yada. At the end of it, Jennin looks at me and says, okay, Z-Man, grab your jacket, let's go. Time for you to get the tour. So I go with him. And again, I don't want to spoil the whole book, but it leads me through hangar after hangar. And it's every door that opens, there's MiGs behind it, either some on static display, some undergoing maintenance. There's MiG-21s in this hangar, T-38s in this hangar, MiG-23s, and this other huge hangar. In between all these are workshops for the maintenance troops to work on anything from repacking drag chutes to hydraulic lines, you name it. So my head's just spinning, because, again, think about this. Before I go up there, most U.S. Air Force and even Navy pilots and Marine Corps are the same. About your only exposure, unless you happen to be one of the lucky few that happen to had flown in a constant peg sortie, your only exposure to a MiG-21 or MiG-23 is what you saw in intelligence manuals and you read about. And usually those were just some grainy black and white photos, maybe something from a Paris Air Show or something like that. So when the hangar door is open and I'm walking in with Jenin to the first large hangar, which houses MiG-21s, I'm taken back because here are no fewer than 9 MiG-21s parked nose to nose. They're right there. I'm going, you got to be kidding me. Anyway, so we go on, and same thing happens when I go to the MiG-23 hangar. And then we go outside, and now these airplanes are starting to taxi for takeoff, and I'm just abuzz. So I get back to Squadron. He introduces me to the operations officer, Major Watley, who is a former he's a F4 Phantom guy. He had been a fighter weapons school graduate and instructor, but he's the operations officer, and he introduces me to a guy named Mock Roy, who actually I happen to know Mock from when I was a lieutenant flying F4s at Kadena, and he'd been in one of the other squadrons and later on went on to fly F-15s. Mike is there in the squadron. Monroe Watley says, okay, Z-Man, here's what's going to go on. Starting next week, actually starting today, your whole job, whole focus is to get in the books. Mike here is going to be your instructor for the next week. You're going to go over everything. Academics, you're going to sit in the airplane, you're going to go through all the switchology, engine starts, flows, emergency procedures, you name it. And then a week from today, you're going to fly it. So I'm thinking, wow. In most squadrons, and just like you had said, Ian, we didn't have any 2C trainers and we didn't have any simulators. So it was all, when you talk about hangar flying, this is really the quintessential hangar flying. I would sit in a MiG-21 inside one of the hangars. If Mike was there, he'd be leaning over the cockpit rail with me, pointing out this, that, and the other thing. And I had the flight manual open or the checklist on my lap and going through procedure by procedure. So this went on for about the next 5-6 days. And then comes the day before you're going to fly it. What we have is, they call it the ground taxi day. And because the MiG-21 was a little squirrely, because it didn't have hydraulically assisted nose wheel steering, it had pneumatic brakes. And this is quite different because it's completely opposite to anything I've ever flown in our Western fighters, where you have a button at the bottom of the control stick. You depress it and you push the rudder to go left or go right, and it can't be anything easier. The MiG-21 was all pneumatically assisted brakes. And so you had a lever at the base of the control stick, which if you wanted to go left or right, simply pushing on the rudder pedal, unless you're going really fast, had no effect on moving the airplane left or right. You had to actually squeeze that lever and then push either left or right rudder to go in whichever direction, and by which case you'd be metering preciously stored high-pressure air to either brake pad. Anyway, so you kind of get the picture. It's really different. So on the morning before I fly, they say, okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to do an engine start, and then you're going to do what we call low-speed taxi. You can start up the airplane, do all your normal procedures, and then you're going to try and taxi out of the chocks all the way down to the end of the runway and then taxi back before you run out of air. And I'm sure everybody, all the crew chiefs would laugh because they'd come out when they'd see this new guy attempting to taxi, and it's probably a comedy of errors there. But our call sign for this sortie wasn't bandit, it was zigzag, because that's exactly what you do. You'd zigzag down the taxiway until you got your feel for it. And luckily, I made it all the way down there and all the way back. And then you have the lunch break, and then you go do it again. But then in the afternoon, again, you're going to start the engine up. You go through the same procedures you did a few hours earlier. And now you're going to take it to the end of the runway. You're going to go through all your pre-departure checklist, before takeoff checklist. Now you're going to call the tower and get clearance onto the runway to do an afterburner run down the runway. pop the drag chute, pull it out of afterburner, and then taxi back, drop the drag chute, taxi back, and again, try to do it all without running out of air. So sure enough, I do. I get in position. Canopy obviously is closed, flaps are down, just like you would be, and you simulate, okay, tomorrow this is going to be for real. But this time I just got it full mill power and then squeeze the throttle lock, push up the full afterburner, let the thing light up, keep it in afterburner until I hit about 100 knots, and then smoothly pull it out of afterburner all the way back to idle, pop the drag chute, make the exit off the runway, drop the drag chute on the infield, and then taxi back. And once again, luckily, made it back without running out of air. So that's your intro to getting ready to fly. And then the next morning, I had 2 flights scheduled the next morning or the next day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And then to get to your initial question, what was it like flying? You're right. No 2-seater. So you're getting ready to take off. And my instructor pilot, Mike Roy, he's in a T-38 chase airplane. He takes the runway with me. He gets clearance for takeoff. So he takes off in front of me. And I wait for him. He does a climbing afterburner turn at the end of the runway once he's airborne, gets his gear up, flaps up, and he's on downwind about 1,000 feet on the reciprocal heading, basically on downwind at 250 knots. And he says, okay, Bandit 1-2, 1-1's ready. And that's my cue to go ahead and push up the throttle to mill power, hold the brakes, obviously. And he says he's ready. So I tell him, okay, 3, 2, 1, here. I release the brakes, lift the throttle lock, smoothly push the throttle up to full afterburner, feel and hear the light off, and away I go. And as I'm doing this, of course, I'm just paying attention to what's going on in my cockpit. Mike Roy is doing this swooping, descending rejoin on me in his T-38. And as I get airborne, lift off at about 160 knots and quickly accelerates really fast. Airplane. By the time I get to the airfield boundary, I got the gear up now. The flaps are up at 220, 230 knots. I'm climbing up in about 15 to 20 degree nose-high climb. Mike Roy is rejoined off my right wing. Of course, I can't see him. And he comes underneath me and does what we call a clean and dry check on me just to make sure all the gear doors are up. Everything's looking good. There's no fluid or hydraulics or fuel leaking. And he says, okay, we're good to go. Let's switch frequencies. We do a check, switch frequencies, and away I go. I continue climbing out into the range, and I'm airborne for the first time in a single-engine fighter, and it happens to be a MiG-21. And it doesn't take any time, really, to get used to it. It's my initial impression is I'm climbing out and big sigh of relief thinking, okay, hey, I'm really doing this. I'm airborne in a MiG. And I'm thinking, man, this thing is just as agile as an F-5. Flies great. I really like it. And then proceed for the next 20, 25 minutes to ring the airplane out slowly, get a little more aggressive in hard turns, stalls, gear up, gear down, that sort of thing, do some loops and hard turns and acceleration maneuvers. And before you know it, it doesn't have a lot of fuel in the airplane. We're on our way back, and we come back to high key for a simulated flame-out approach. And I'm thinking, man, of course, I've never flown anything single engine, but this is my first time coming back to the airfield in a MiG, and I'm going to go to high key, which is about 12,000 feet above the airfield. And you get there and you have your gears up, your flaps are up, your speed brakes are out, and over the numbers, you get clearance for the SFO, simulated flame-out approach from tower, and they clear you for this SFO, and Mike Roy is chasing me on the outside of the turn, and I go into it, never having done one, and I'm thinking, okay, and do this descending, falling leaf maneuver to roll out on final, and of course the airplane's just descending like a banshee with all that drag on it, and of course as soon as you put the gear down, you increase your drag even more, so now you have to really lower the nose, and the whole idea is if you had a no-kidding engine anomaly where you had degraded engine performances, could you make it back to the field and save the airplane? So anyway, survived all that, got told by Mike Roy, okay, that's low enough, go around. And this is the first time the engine performance really gets your attention because the spool up on the MiG-21, the R11 300 engine on it wasn't very quick, not like the J79 or the J85 engine on the F5, which are almost instantaneous. This thing had quite a delay. Like you went from flight idle to afterburner, it'd be a solid 10 to 11 seconds. So when you went around, you had to plan it well ahead of time before you would, otherwise you'd actually impact the ground. But anyway, survived that, then did a couple close patterns and normal landings. And at the end of the second one, rolled out, final, full stop, popped the drag chute and taxied back. And you come back to the chocks and shut the airplane down. The crew chief comes up and shakes my hand and says, "Congratulations, you're America's newest MiG pilot." That was it. That was my first sortie in MiG-21.
Wow. Well, just like that, Rob, you make it sound quite easy. Where did the US Air Force find these MiGs? Unless you can't share that with me.
No, I can share that because everything now is open source. For a long time, it was a really closely guarded secret. And all the MiG-21s, we flew, the MiG-21s we flew, the Soviet-built MiG-21s, were all MiG-21 F-13 models. And all of them came from Indonesia, with the exception of one. One we got from Israel, and it had actually been it had been a defector aircraft the Israelis had gotten from Iraq. If viewers want to Google Operation Diamond in MiG-21 in Israel, see, Mossad-led operation, they had actually gotten an Iraqi captain to defect in 1966. What then was a brand new to the Western world MiG-21. So that airplane, years later, long story, you can read all about it. That airplane was loaned to the U.S. Air Force to exploit during half donut exploitation, and later it was part of Have Idea. And then I ended up flying that airplane. It was at airplane number 007. And I flew that airplane for quite some time as part of the Red Eagles. But all the rest of them were MiG-21s. And then we had in addition to those, we had 8 Chinese F-7s, which were basically a Chinese knockoff of the MiG-21 and almost identical copy. There were some subtle differences, which I point out in the book. But to the untrained eye, airplanes were sitting side by side, airborne off your wing. You probably wouldn't know the difference. And for all practical purposes, they flew almost identical. So very subtle differences that only an experienced MiG pilot would know. But those all came right from Red China and brand new. In fact, one day I went out to the airplane. It was an F-7 that I had never seen before, never flown before. And as I opened the logbook, I looked in there and I noted it had a total of 3.5 hours on it. So we all think about getting into a new car showroom and stepping into your latest Mercedes or Jaguar or whatever and has that new car smell. This had that new MiG smell to it. You walk in, I sat down, I go, my God, 3.5 hours. I was afraid, I was embarrassed to even step on the seat cushion for fear of getting it dirty. But anyway, so that's how we got all the MiG-21s and the F-7s. And now the MiG-23s, that was easier. I shouldn't say it was easier. We got all those, both the air-to-ground and air-to-air model. We got those from Egypt. And all the heavy legwork and footwork was done by the CIA years before, in 1977. And later on, that became part of the IDEA program, the initial MiG-23 MS, which is a floggery that was exploited as part of a half-pad exploitation. And that was 1978. And then the Red Eagles got their first MiG-23 in 1980, and just a few years later, I was flying it. And yeah, so that's how we got all those airplanes.
And what was all the instrumentation changed over to English, or was it still in Cyrillic or Chinese?
All the Soviet-built airplanes were all in Cyrillic. All the Chinese airplanes, the F-7s, were all in English, surprisingly. Now, having said that, all the switchology, there are a few labels that some of our maintenance guys had put like a little sticky label on it. This was that or the other thing. But for the most part, all the instrumentation was all stock Soviet. Now, the notable exceptions were we did put a U.S. altimeter on it, so we read in feet rather than meters. Airspeed indicator, obviously read in knots versus kilometers per hour. We put a U.S. radio in it, and we put a U.S. transponder in it, IFF, And we also had to change the oxygen and G-suit hookup so we could obviously inflate our G-suits and plug in our oxygen mask and our comm cord. So other than that, everything was stock. Yeah.
Yeah, it must have been an incredible job maintaining these aircraft and getting spares for them as well.
Yeah, I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out, because the real magicians of this whole thing, and really the reason, in large part, that the program Constant Peg was the success it was, due in no small part to our maintainers. These guys made the extraordinary look ordinary. Every day, think about it, you couldn't just go out and order a part, obviously, from the Soviet Union. That just wasn't going to happen. So how they sourced parts was clandestinely, back channels or different countries, not necessarily on the open market for sure. Sometimes they had to fabricate their own parts. They did have some contracts with some U.S. vendors for things like tires, brakes, canopies. Engine maintenance, for instance, was done by GE under a Black World project. That I believe that all the engine overhauls were done at Edwards Air Force Base at the North Complex there by GE. But yeah, it was a real challenge. And luckily, the MiG-21 was a pretty simple airplane. And I say that from my viewpoint, simple airplane to maintain. It seemed to us, because in the 2+ years I flew the MiG-21, I never had an emergency whatsoever on the MiG-21. It seemed like it was gas, oil, change tires, and go. It just didn't break. MiG-23 was a totally different story, and that was very maintenance intensive. But think about what the complexity of something like an F-4 Phantom would be to like a T-38. It's along those lines. T-38 was very simple. F-4 Phantom, a lot of man hours to keep that airplane flying. Similar MiG-23 versus MiG-21. So my hat's off to our maintenance troops and support troops. I only had one major emergency in the MiG-23. Had a couple of fire lights here and there, but luckily those were false fire lights. But yeah, they never let me down. Luckily my landings equaled my takeoffs. Yeah, pretty lucky and pretty impressed with the incredible job they did.
You described flying the MiG-21. What was the MiG-23 like to fly when you compared it with U.S. fighters?
If I simply said it was totally different, that wouldn't be doing much. But just a totally different beast. I described the F-4 Phantom like being a muscle car compared to the T-38 being a sports car. Similar MiG-23 versus MiG-21. The MiG-23 was a heavy airplane. It just felt like it. You started up, it felt heavy. Taxiing was a lot easier. It actually did have hydraulically assisted nose wheel steering with the flaps up and things like that. So the ground operation is a lot easier. But because of the complexity, not only swing wing design, variable geometry, airframe, engine problems, finicky at times. Again, luckily I never had any engine problems. But yeah, it was something you really had to be on your toes. Because whereas the MiG-21, I wouldn't say the MiG-21 you just get in and wouldn't have to think about it. But yeah, the MiG-21 had no surprises. The MiG-23 was full of surprises. Whereas I could take the MiG-21 at almost any airspeed, pull the stick back, and just launch it into the vertical, even if I didn't have the airspeed to get vertical. The airplane, at least, it may stall, but it wouldn't depart on you. The MiG-23 was just the opposite. And it was no mistake that the angle of attack gauge, which the MiG-21 did not have, at least the variant that we had, the MiG-21 did not have an AOA gauge. The MiG-23 did, and was prominently displayed just to the left of the heads-up display.
The angle of attack is the difference between where the wing is pointing and where it's going. So the higher the angle of attack increases the lift and drag to the point that if it's too high, you get a stall. Hopefully that helps you with the next section.
You learned very quickly whenever you flew the airplane, whenever you changed configuration from the wings full forward at 16 degrees, going back to 45 to 72, whatever you did, accelerating, pulling back on the stick, slowing down, you always did so with an eye on that angle of attack gauge. Because as your center of gravity would change with the wings going either forward or back, so too would your angle of attack. And consequently, you had different angle of attack limitations for airspeeds in each configuration. So to really max perform the airplane, you had to keep an eye on that. You would fly the airplane. You'd like to try to fly it. And in some instances, the MiG-23, when I would fly it hard, and to a certain extent, it was similar to a hard wing F-4 Phantom. And when I say hard wing, a Phantom without leading edge slats. Consequently, the F-4C and the F-4D I flew. When I flew the F-4E models, most of them later generations all had leading edge slats. Very easy to fly. The F-4D had a departure in the F-4C. When you had it loaded up, high angle of attack, and you tried to put in aileron, if you didn't lead with rudder, it would depart on you. It would snap roll off to the right or left in the opposite direction you wanted to go. Similarly, in some instances, the flogger was similar. If you exceeded your allowable angle of attack and you got into the red and black hatch zone, it would real quickly depart on you. Now, the flogger did not have ailerons on it. So whenever you turn the airplane, you use a combination of spoilers on top of the wings or differential stabilator. So it was sluggish in roll because of that. And also, again, as I just mentioned, angle of attack, you had to really watch it. So consequently, coming from the MiG-21, now jumping into the MiG-23, and mind you, my transition from the MiG-21 to the MiG-23 was only 6 days. I left the 21. The last sortie I'd flown was on a Thursday. The following Thursday, took my first sortie in the first flight of the MiG-23. Same kind of experience, going through and learning, going through, sitting in the cockpit, in a hangar, having the logbook or the checklist on my lap and going through all the motions. But you knew real quickly, in hearing from all my squadron mates who were flying the MiG-23, hey, watch out for this, watch out for that. And we had pretty good corporate knowledge by that time of what to do and what not to do. Still, there were some things unwritten in the checklist, in the flight manual that we only found out by discovering them ourselves. One of which I had the luxury of flying or discovering, or the misfortune of discovering just a month and a half later on about my 26 hopping airplane. But you had to really be on your toes flying the MiG-23. So a lot of people did not want to fly the MiG-23 because they'd heard all the, I wouldn't say horror stories, but they just wasn't as fun to fly. To me, I look forward to flying. In fact, I asked the operations officer, I let him know months before, hey, when the opportunity presents itself, I want to fly it. So I did. It was great.
In the book, you describe that challenging flight you have in the MiG-23, but we'll let people buy the book to go through that. I find it amazing that this was kept secret for so long, because obviously the value of having these aircraft is to fly them against other US aircraft. So the more you fly it against other squadrons, the larger that circle of trust is growing.
Correct. And luckily, back in the day, of course, this is Constant Peg originally started in 1977. They got their first airplanes in 78, and it closed down 10 years later, 1988. But over that 10-year period, starting off with just a handful of a couple MiG-17s, a few MiG-21s, and then later on, by the time I got there, the MiG-17, they had one left, and one, tragically, they lost in a crash, and pilot was killed, but they had one left, and when I got there, they had stopped flying it. So they just had MiG-21s and the MiG-23. But over the course of 10 years, they exposed over 6,000 U.S. fighter pilots, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, to MiGs in some way, shape, or form. And it is remarkable. That's why I say arguably the best kept secret of the Cold War, because despite the number of people who had exposure to it, luckily back then, no one had cell phones. and there was no internet. And it was also the sort of thing when you were read into the program and you sat in that auditorium for the first time, and two pilots from the Red Eagles, sporting Red Eagle patches on their right shoulder, came in and briefed you on what you were about to see that day, having never heard about it before. You took it pretty seriously. And you're also pretty proud that you were lucky enough to be part of that. So part of that briefing was you signed paperwork saying you would not acknowledge anything that you're about to witness that week. And after you left here, even though there were other people in your squadron, if they had not had that same brief, you couldn't even tell them about it. Now, they probably had a pretty good idea maybe of what you had done, but even then, you wouldn't even talk about it in the hallways, the bar, anywhere. So how it was kept such a secret is really a testament to the program and the secrecy and the black curtain that it was kept behind.
Were you able to tell your wife what you were doing?
Luckily, I was single at the time, so I didn't have that problem like some men did. Now, obviously, dated quite a few ladies and things like that. But the cover story that those that we could use, and this is something that was the blanket cover story, was the 4477 flew highly modified, unspecified F5 and F4 test airframes. And that's what we told everybody. And what lent credence to that was a lot of us, and for years, we flew with the aggressors. So the two aggressor squadrons back at Nellis, when I was a Red Eagle, for the first year I was there, I flew attached to the 65th Aggressor Squadron. So occasionally, a few times a month, I would walk down to 65th and I'd fly with them in their F5s, or I'd go on the road with them when they would do a DACT deployment to, say, Eglin to fight against F-15s or Langley F-15s or wherever it might be. So that kind of lent credence to our cover story as well, because they could see, well, here's a guy who wears the Red Eagle patch and he's flying F-5s with the aggressors. So I guess that makes sense. And we also had other people flying with the F-15 Fighter Weapons School, the F-4 Weapons School, and was still there. So that's our cover story, and it worked out pretty well. Yeah, so it didn't really have a problem, and we didn't talk about it at the bar. And if people did want to talk about it, we would just say, and openly, you say, we never used the word MiG anywhere. On the radio, in the bar, even in the squadron, we'd always say F5 for MiG-21 or F4 for MiG-23. So you could be at the bar and you could run into somebody you'd flown against earlier in the day. He might want to come up to you and talk about whatever. But they're well briefed that if you're going to talk about it, you can say F4, that's all you can say, or F5. That's what we did, and yeah, it stayed a secret.
I like how in the book you illustrate how valuable that training was to the US Air Force when it did go into action. And I think one of the interesting ones that I enjoyed was when you were telling the story of this odd or unusual F-111 exercise.
Oh, yeah. For those of you that are listening and haven't read the book, there's a chapter in there where I was very fortunate to be part of a very odd mission that we had direct tasking from headquarters, U.S. Air Force, from the Pentagon, to fly a 4-ship of MiGs. On this particular day, it turned out to be 3 MiG-21s, one of which I was flying, and a single MiG-23, against some UK-based F-111s. And it was a rather unusual mission, and I'm not going to give away the whole story unless you want me to, Ian. But interesting enough, this was in October of 85, because I was still flying the MiG-21. Oddly enough, or perhaps a total coincidence, 6 months later came Operation El Dorado Canyon and the raid on Libya. Now, and I'll let the reader decide for themselves the unique mission, but we had this sortie where we flew some against some F-111s, and I'll just leave it at that. And a lot of people say it was just a mere coincidence that the raid on Libya happened 6 months later, but there were enough very unique things that occurred that were more than just coincidental. And anyway, so I'll just leave it at that. But flying against some 111s down low over the high desert when they're egressing in excess of 600 knots, and it was pretty interesting stuff. But that's not too many people that actually knew about it. And I'm hoping somewhere, someday, someone who either listens to this or reads the book is going to say, hey, I was in one of those 111s, and this is the rest of that story.
Yeah, I've got an interview with an F-111 pilot that did fly in El Dorado Canyon. I'll drop him an email and see whether he or he knew anybody who flew on that exercise. And that is one of many great stories in the book. You have been listening to Lieutenant Colonel Rob Z-Man Zettel. He is the author of a new book, American MiG Pilot, Inside the Top Secret US Air Force Red Eagles MiG Squadron. There are loads more stories in the book. There will be links in the episode notes showing you where you can buy the book and help to support the podcast. Rob, is there anything else you want to add that we've missed or anything you want to share?
No, I think you've covered a pretty good portion of the book, different chapters that went along, how I got there, a little bit about my background and that sort of thing. And I think the listeners, as you've alluded to, there's a lot of stories in the book. And one thing for the listener, everything that I've put in the book were things that I actually witnessed firsthand. And as Ian would note, having read it, that I make reference to dates, times, actual aircraft tail numbers that I flew to add authenticity to them and to the book and the experiences. And to do that, I relied heavily on my own logbook, and then I was able to reconcile that with the Air Force logs that I was given upon my retirement from the U.S. Air Force. And so it adds, I could actually match up exact times, dates, aircraft I was flying, and the actual tail numbers. So thank God I had those, because without that, it would have been hard to replicate some of those scenes. And I had over 35 interviews with other Red Eagle pilots, maintenance types, and other squadron members along the way. A great amount of research went into it. Took me quite a few years to finally finish it, but I think the listener will enjoy the read.
It is a rattling good read. Some of the descriptions of the missions you were flying and how those missions worked, it is literally like being in the cockpit with you. It's really well written, and I've really enjoyed it, Rob. Thank you very much for coming on Cold War Conversations.
Welcome, Ian. Been my pleasure to be here.
The episode extras, such as videos, photos, and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War Conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.